cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. By the way, this episode is also available as a video on our YouTube channel. Just search Energypreneurs. Thank you for joining. Hi, Stephanie. Good morning from Manila, Philippines. Where are you today?
Good morning, Sahel. I'm actually from Melbourne, Australia.
Oh, I'm so jealous you're in Melbourne. So we are going there next month. Anyway, I had a brief look at your CV. We met a few years back. I mean, you've been everywhere: energy transition, strategies, solar, regulation, smart energy council. Maybe you tell a bit yourself first.
I've been in energy now for over 23 years. That shows a little bit my age, but you never get bored in energy, which is why I've stuck around. There's always something big happening. I spent probably a good chunk of that career in retail, wholesale, distribution, and other parts of the value chain. Worked at AGL for a big chunk, as well as that part of my career as the Senior Director of Public Policy, where we set up the new energy division, set up a metering business that is now part of Ausgrid called Plus ES. And then 2018, I decided to step outside of my comfort zone there and set up Nexa Advisory. And so as founder and CEO of Nexa Advisory, the key purpose and focus of Nexa is to accelerate the clean energy transition with people. And so that's who we are and what we do.
Yes. And for our international audience, AGL is one of the largest utilities in Australia, right?
Of course. So AGL basically is a generator, wholesale, and retailer. It's one of the largest energy companies in Australia, Australian owned. And basically it's across the value chain. They have generation assets, coal, gas, renewables, and of course they're also an energy retailer and wholesale trader in energy.
Yes, I mean, when we briefly discussed, you were mentioning that you are so passionate to make sure or ensure the policies are in place so that the coals get shut down when the time is due or even earlier, and overall how to bring in energy transition and accelerate it, no? So you want to expand a bit more?
Yeah. So I guess, in Australia, the government has actually set emissions targets and signed up to the Paris Agreement. But Australia also has a very vast coal assets that have supported our generation in energy for decades. But a lot of our coal generation power assets are now coming to their end of life. So it's a really low-hanging fruit if we have a very clear plan on how we're going to basically exit the coal power stations and replace them with clean energy. And so for me, I think the coal exits is a really clear pathway for us to meet our emissions targets, but it's also important for Australians. While our coal assets have actually kept the lights on for all these decades, that's not the case anymore. We've got now, they are reaching their technical end of life, and that closure, clear closure plan is going to be important to make sure that we attract the right investments in renewables, wind, solar, batteries, energy storage, and the right kind of mix of generation to replace the coal power stations as they exit. The unfortunate thing that would happen is that we continue to subsidize these aging assets to keep them on for longer than their technical lives. And the problem with that is that our over-reliance on these unreliable assets means unreliable power. It also means impact on energy bills because wholesale price, when there's power outages at these coal power stations, especially unplanned coal power outages, the wholesale price goes up to its peak. and it ends up being passed through on electricity.
Let me understand, how are these subsidies going to work? Are the government giving long-term hedge contracts against a pool? Because if they are facing the wholesale electricity market, the way the batteries are coming and the solar is there, with their need to quick ramp up, they won't survive. I mean, that's what we are seeing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's not clear. There's no transparency on the contractual arrangements between government and the owners of the power stations. Unless, for example, when the contracts were set up in Victoria, they were set up to close on time.
Mhm.
But contracts itself, we don't really know what the subsidies are, how they're set up, and what it means in terms of the underwriting. In New South Wales, so Victoria is very different to New South Wales, and every state is taking a very different approach. And that's because ultimately the state energy ministers are responsible to keep the lights on.
Mhm.
So while federally we have a federal government, they come up with policies, they come up with targets and plans. Ultimately, it's the state's responsibility when it comes to energy. And so that's where in Australia, that federal versus state, you find inconsistencies depending on who's in power. And it becomes quite difficult to manage the uncertainty with policy because of those differences and misalignment between federal and state. It even gets messier when you have, let's say, we've got the two parties here, the two main major parties, Labor and Liberal, as you know, in Australia. It becomes even more uncertain when you've got different government political parties between federal and state, and inconsistencies become even harder. As we've seen recently with the change of government in Queensland, we've seen, a change of government to the Liberal Party in Queensland, and that has led to quite significant decisions over the last 6 months about the energy policy plans, removing the targets from their legislation, the clean energy targets through the amendment bill in Queensland. So I guess that all adds to the energy policy uncertainty, but it also adds to climate change policy uncertainty. And that really results in issues with investors and investor appetite. We haven't seen the results yet of what that could mean, but we are seeing investors actually really calling for greater transparency and certainty when it comes to energy and climate change policy here in Australia.
But apart from the sort of federal government or the state government coming into and fiddling with the sort of energy supply side to ensure lights on or whatever the agenda behind it, the market is moving very fast, right? I mean, you mentioned the 20 or plus years that you have been in the industry. It has changed. I mean, it was unthinkable what's happening with solar and the batteries. Australia throwing $7+ billion into battery subsidy. I mean, on the other side, where the private sector is working out and with the federal government support, extraordinary things are happening, no? You want to make some comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not all pessimistic. In Australia, on the large scale side, where we are requiring renewable investment in Australia, I mean, the investor appetite and technology and the significant projects that are being proposed in the pipeline is not the problem. We've got a huge pipeline of wind, solar, and significant pipeline and batteries in each of the states, Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales. And that's very good news. It does actually really mean that investors are keen on getting the right capital investment done here in Australia, which is what's needed, private capital. I think one of the key barriers on the large scale side to be able to bring those projects online is transmission. As a high voltage grid, we need new grid in new areas to be able to connect the new wind projects, to connect the solar projects. And those basically, the transmission is held up in, there's a number of factors for the delays in transmission, being the red tape and regulatory approvals, the out of date, as you said, we've come a long way in energy here in Australia. And when the rules were set up for transmission here in Australia back in the day, they were set up to basically stop investment, stop the gold plating. And so now we're in energy transition where we need investment to happen fast and built in the right places. And we're working around these, if you like, out of date regulatory processes. And then the third thing, of course, we're all in a race for the supply chains, for the right technologies when it comes to transmission transformers and steel and all sorts of things that basically also create some of the delays. But on the small scale side, the consumer side, we lead when it comes to rooftop solar. We've got the highest uptake per capita in the world when it comes to rooftop solar and batteries now, as a result of people making the decision and making their personal investment to put solar on their roofs and batteries in their home. And the federal government's home battery scheme that was announced earlier in the year was quite a significant policy. I think probably in my career in energy, I would have to say that has to be one of the best policies that has been introduced in decades in energy, because it does give power to the people.
Yes, indeed. I mean, right now, maybe, I don't know, 40,000 megawatt of rooftop solar behind the meter sitting there, right?
Yeah.
And if you allow the batteries, and people are building 50 plus kilowatt hour batteries in some cases, when an average consumption is 20, the whole residential demand, which is more than a third, is going to elope, right?
Absolutely.
And that's going to have a dramatic effect, because before people wanted, I mean, I have a house, I have a battery, but only sort of 13.5 Tesla battery. But if I had 25 or 30, more than 2 days of sort of supply, and then you have your car with a V2G that's coming up.
Yeah.
The whole thinking is very different, especially with 1/3 of the load these power companies have been relying on traditionally, no?
Yeah. So I call it consumers are now eating the lunch of incumbents. That's both the generators and the distribution electricity networks.
Yep.
That's been quite a significant change here in terms of the energy value chain, moving from a push to the consumer, we're going to charge you this, we're going to do this to you, to the consumers here in Australia are saying, no, this is what I want. And they're taking more control. And when we did the analysis a few years ago about why do people take up solar, the number one reason why people take up solar is to reduce their energy bills. And number two, obviously, to be independent. And number three is because it's environmentally, they want to give back to the environment and to the community. But number one is absolutely to reduce energy bills. As you know, Sahel, because you've been around for such a long time and keep across the Australian market, electricity in Australia is not cheap. And prices are only going up. Even though renewables are the cheapest form, electricity prices continue to go up. And that's for a number of reasons, which we can talk about if you want to. But, people are saying we've had enough. Cost of living pressures or not, we're going to take energy into our hands. And that's been quite a significant, if you like, grassroots change in our market here in Australia. And it's fantastic to see. But we still have barriers in space. And we'd like to see some of those changes occur, because we've been talking about them for such a long time. Back even when I was at AGL and we set up the new energy division, we were talking about how do we get the right tariffs in place? How do we reform the network electricity charges so that people can get the true value out of their solar batteries and investments while ensuring it doesn't impact everybody else. And that's been still a conversation, and we still haven't had the change that we need to make that happen.
What specific changes you'll be looking for that?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the moment, the electricity bill for an average home is made up of mainly wholesale and network charges.
Yep.
And that includes transmission costs, of course.
Yep.
But the main cost in a bill, we can talk about the wholesale costs of electricity, which is about 40% or so on average. And then the network distribution charges on average is about 35 to 48%, depending on the state. That's quite significant. So while the wholesale electricity charges, we've had a lot of reforms. There's a lot of, if you like, pricing reviews that goes into it, a lot of scrutiny at that, which is all appropriate. There hasn't been the same attention on the electricity distribution charges. So they have remained somewhat in the same way they have been since, we had the retail franchise and the pricing and the cost recovery mechanisms that were introduced back in the day for the networks to recover costs through their distribution charges. But a lot has changed. Now we're talking about two-way flow of energy. Consumers having solar, having battery, excess energy goes back into the grid. They should be rewarded for that if they are removing a need for augmentation and so on and so forth. And so that really hasn't occurred. And so, we've seen piecemeal changes over the years, band-aids, if you like, but fundamentally, we still have a capex bias when it comes to how networks recover their costs. Because at the moment, which we can talk a little bit about, the current cost recovery mechanism for electricity distribution networks here in Australia right now means they are incentivized to spend on poles and wires. That's how they were set up in the past, which was right in the day. But now they don't need to do that because there's other solutions, non-network solutions. And so we need that pricing and the economic regulatory framework for these electricity distribution networks to keep up with the pace.
Yes, because those days, embedded generation was quite hypothetical. Okay, you will do, but overall, network needs to be there. Da, da, da. But now, embedded generation is every household, right?
Absolutely. That's, to me, electric vehicles are a solution to the network problem. Networks are saying, during the day when solar is, especially here where there's a lot of solar penetration, it's basically eating their lunch. The grid isn't being utilized at the rate that they expect to get a return. And so batteries help with that. Electric vehicles help with that, and with the right behavior tariffs that we could have in place to incentivize people, charge your car during the day, on your lunch break, in your workspace, going from A to B. EVs are a solution to the problem. But unfortunately, the conversation and the debate that we've had here in Australia is being positioned that EVs are a problem, but they're not.
Yeah, they're definitely not.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah.
Because EVs are, again, it's an appliance that take electricity, but also takes it back. So when it gives it back, so people have to appreciate, like someone mentioned in my podcast saying, we do not appreciate really that when we buy a car, purpose of driving around, it comes with a free battery inside, which is maybe 3 or 4 times the size of the battery I would have bought. So if you take it from that perspective, then of course the EVs are part of the solution. It might be eating not the lunch, maybe the dinner when it comes and takes the electricity back to the grid, no? Because 65, 70 kilowatt hour of battery, significant when average person maybe only taken 20 kilowatt hour to do everyday driving, maybe even 10, depending on who is driving, no?
Exactly. And so you could see, we're trying to solve many of these problems at the moment. On the large scale side, continue to have reliability that we've enjoyed for so many decades and make sure we have that transition accelerated, done in an orderly way. And then on the small scale side, people should be rewarded for the investment they're making and not penalized. And I think that's going to be really important from energy, if you like, affordability perspective, right? But also from a social license. One of our biggest problems on the large scale side at the moment, getting transmission done, is getting people on board with the transition. And one of the biggest ways to do that is through people's bills and getting basically that social license that energy is, they need to be empowered to take control of their energy.
Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah. So, one of the things at the moment we're facing, especially in transmission, and I'll give you as an example here in Victoria, in the state of Victoria, we have a number of transmission projects that, have needed to be built over the last 4 or 5 years. The Victorian interconnector between Victoria and New South Wales, which is called VNI West, and the Western Renewables link, which basically links Victoria from one side of Victoria to the other to enable new wind projects to happen onshore. But these two projects specifically have been highly contested when it comes to the social license, the basically landowners, farmers, and others. And one of the things that, especially in the western region of Victoria, people have been calling for is, can we get the basics right? Can we get our roads fixed? Because they're hosting the transmission and the onshore wind, they're not necessarily directly getting the value from these. There's still the energy is flowing into cities and suburbs of Victoria. And so we've got to be able to demonstrate to everybody that everyone's going to get the benefit out of these investments we're making in the replacement generation. And it really starts in the home. So when I say we've got to continue to reward people for putting in solar, putting in batteries, because I think the social license starts at home. People are putting these investments in. They should be rewarded for their investments through cheaper bills. But also then, how do we make that a norm for everyone else? And I guess one of the things, again, I go back to that home battery scheme that the federal government introduced, because that opens it up for a much broader part of the population to afford those batteries in their homes. And when, we've done the analysis, but so has the Australian Energy Regulator, publicizes the pricing, solar and batteries at scale reduce wholesale prices for everybody. And so that's a really important affordability thing.
Yeah, but that subsidy now only targets people who has solar or going to install solar. See, if I'm an apartment owner, just want to take the battery subsidy, put batteries, that is right now not allowed, as I understand, no?
Yeah, no, that's right. So they're trying to make sure that people aren't putting in batteries larger than what they're going to need because of that larger component of the subsidy. So after planning from the subsidy, the scheme over the last 6 months, I think it's the right thing to do in looking at how, what are we incentivizing in terms of size of battery in homes and depending on your home. And it's a little bit like when the solar panels started to get installed, they went through the same phases they're doing now with batteries. I think one of the things that I think is missing from this whole conversation on solar and batteries is that commercial and industrial customers. Businesses are impacted the most from high electricity prices, we're seeing businesses basically shutting down because of energy affordability. And when we did the analysis in our CNI report, we found 28 gigawatts of untapped potential where you could actually roll out solar and batteries on distribution warehouses, business precincts, roofs of like the car sales like IKEA and other kind of, if you like, warehouse roofs. And we've only got 5 gigawatts across Australia right now in terms of commercial and industrial uptake, which is really, really low considering the potential that this would have, not only on reducing directly the energy bills of commercial businesses, but also the potential that has on reliability and energy security. When we talk about virtual power plants, and I'm sure you've covered that in some of your other podcasts, virtual power plants, and when I was at AGL, we launched the first virtual power plant here in Australia, and I was leading it from a policy perspective. And it was residential. It's still there in South Australia at the moment. The value isn't in the VPPs because the reward is very, very small, and that comes back to the electricity distribution charges. But the bigger reward is with the CNI customers. It's commercially viable to install solar and batteries, and the energy reliability that they would then offer to the market is quite significant in compared to the residential in terms of size and gigawatts.
Absolutely. And also, I think the commercial load shape is very much peaking in the middle of the day, and then it's invert of the solar. So that is even better value than residential, where the traditional peak used to be still in the evening, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
What does government need to do? Why not the commercial players doing it on their own? Because financing is available. I'm sure large utilities are also offering incentives, no?
So one of the things, I think there's a few pieces of the puzzle to resolve on this one. And the first one is currently there's no scheme that covers an incentive for commercial businesses to take this up. A lot of them are saying, why should we do this? And it does require them to invest quite a bit in CapEx upfront. And they find that difficult in the cost pressures that we're at the moment economically here in Australia. And so one of the things that we think would actually benefit that uptake and closing the gap on that untapped potential is a scheme similar to the home battery scheme, whether it's an expansion of that to cover the mid-scale commercial and industrial. We're not talking here about the Tomagos and the large kind of fleet. We're talking here about the larger mid-scale businesses that could really add value to the system. The other issue is a lot of those businesses don't own their roofs.
Yep.
So there needs to be a kind of an arrangement where the owners of large roofs, and again, the government could play a huge role in incentivizing or bringing to the table those discussions to make that happen as part of our energy security and national energy security and reliability conversation. And to me, I see those two are the main two things that would help unlock the untapped potential in the commercial space. And the rewards are there for the businesses themselves, for government to manage the energy reliability, especially, Australia's got very hot peaking days, and we lose our core power units on those very hot days usually. And we see ministers going on TV saying, please reduce your energy bills. Imagine the different conversation we would be having if we could cover these commercial sites with solar and batteries when it comes to those reliability hot days. And then, of course, the value is also for everyone else. One of the key benefits of accelerating rooftop solar and batteries on commercial sites is that it lowers the wholesale price for everybody for that reason of energy security and viability.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm just a bit intrigued with these numbers. The national market is about maximum demand is 35 gigawatts, something like that, no? Home batteries are almost the same, but sort of not always there. And
Yeah,
then you're saying another 30 or gigawatt in commercial. So when all these solar come into effect and Australia, say, has 60 gigawatt equivalent of rooftop solar in homes and in commercial premises, and then of course there is a large amount of wind and solar that are setting wholesale electricity prices. I mean, coal and everything else will be automatically squeezed out in that world, no? How will they survive? I
absolutely.
mean, and then who will pay for the network charges for transmission and distribution? Because I get intrigued because when a customer, you at AGL, if I go and ring up saying, hey, I want my house to be connected, you as a regulatory retail license holder has an obligation to connect. But does it automatically give me the right to disconnect? You might say, sorry, I don't want to pay 40% of network charges anymore. I have a bigger battery. I've got 2 cars. How will manage? What is
It's,
the future looks like?
it's a very important question you raised, Sahad. And that's the conversation we need to have. That conversation isn't being had in an adult way, basically. Let's put it that way. You know, there's obviously a lot of advocacy happening and lobbying happening from the incumbent electricity distribution networks to say consumers are eating our breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know, our current cost recovery model isn't going to work in the future. But rather than having these conversations openly so that everyone brings their solution to the table, people are bringing their vested interests to the table. And that makes it a very difficult conversation to have. So, what we need to see, first of all, is can we have a chat about how the cost recovery, economic regulatory framework, and the cost recovery is going to work into the future for the electricity distribution networks? You know, at the moment, it's, as I mentioned, it's CapEx wise. They have to invest in poles and wires to make their regulatory revenue. But we can't have that ongoing because, as you also say, you know, solar and batteries are taking over. So what are they going to do? Start selling solar and batteries? Some of them want to do that. But why should the public be paying for a regulated monopoly to provide that service when it's a competitive market?
Yep.
Doesn't make sense. And it's a huge debate here in Australia at the moment. The network getting into that competitive space to fill that gap rather than thinking more openly and saying, what is the best cost recovery model for us moving forward? And do these businesses then become at a certain point in time, competitive businesses like everybody else? And that, you know, the poles and wires, if you like, part of the bill that we get in our electricity rate, could it be part of our council rates? Just like we pay for our roads.
Yeah.
Just like we pay for, you know, so it's kind of like trying to think outside the box, but it's a very difficult conversation to be had when you're talking to businesses who are regulated monopolies, but they have shareholders. They're privately owned. So we privatized in Victoria and New South Wales. We privatized our electricity distribution networks. And so this conversation really is you're basically saying to their shareholders, we're going to disrupt your model as a private company, but you are still a regulated monopoly and have a responsibility to the Australian public.
Yes, I mean, privatized or otherwise, issue is that the fundamental assumption was that distribution is a natural monopoly. We have seen everywhere. I've written a lot about that as a pricing manager. That fundamental assumption is getting shattered now. Is distribution really a monopoly? I can have my EV charge at your house and drive at home and connect my house. That thing did not exist.
You are an electricity distribution network as an individual.
Yeah.
So basically customers in Australia who have solar, batteries, EVs, or all of the above, the networks, they are a competitor to the networks themselves who provide them that service and the connection to the grid.
Yeah. On that basis, I think exactly as you're saying, it needs to rethink the whole concept that distribution is a natural monopoly. During the privatization of Kennett government, at that time, I don't know whether you remember, we had 19 municipal undertakings like a Preston City Council, Doncaster. They were all owned by the sort of council. So we bought them back, or SECV, and collected together, split up into 5 companies, and we privatized. I'm talking what we was part of the Victorian government.
Yeah.
So those days, assumption was it's a natural monopoly. Maybe it's no longer, right? It can be tiny bit of monopoly. Okay, Preston monopoly, Brunswick monopoly, your South Melbourne monopolies, right? And maybe that's what the sustainability level. You don't need the entire state to be one, no?
Exactly. And this is like having that conversation that opens up a whole different discussion when we're talking about network resilience solution. We have huge issues with our floods and heat waves and storms and all sorts of things that really impact people's livelihoods and lives. And resilience is a huge topic, but is that a monopoly? Could we have these, because the solutions aren't balls and wires.
Insurance.
They're not network solutions.
Yes, absolutely.
Why do they need to be on the regulated monopoly RABs when a lot of these solutions can be brought in through microgrids, energy storage, community energy, batteries, and things like that? And so that conversation is not being had in the right way through the right channels. In fact, the only conversation that's being had is how do we protect our turf? Of course. And, you could understand why, but enough is enough. Like, that has been a conversation for the last decade. And we are still the highest country per capita to have rooftop solar and batteries, and that's just even going to grow even bigger. So when are we going to have that conversation? That's my call out to governments and the electricity incumbents to actually bring a conversation that is open to the table about how are we going to manage this moving forward.
Yeah, especially we have to be very wary of what just happened in Pakistan in the last 2-3 years. They were the second largest consumer or importer of solar panels. People said enough with the utilities, and that's what I've been hearing, and also interviewed few people. Someone said, okay, putting a rooftop solar basic is not difficult enough, okay? And he or she did it, then did a TikTok, and 200 other people did it. Whole country had.
The whole movement, and that's grassroots.
Yes.
And that is exactly what we need.
Yes, that's what I'm saying, that Australians are maybe per capita, of course, way more richer, way more early adopter, tech savvy. So these distribution companies have to be very wary of. Suddenly something can click, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And we'll see Stephanie in the front of it, I think.
And we need that. We need to empower those people to do that. But that conversation isn't being had in that way at the moment, even with our regulators and, the AEMC recently with I don't know if you saw last week, the Australian Commission, who does our rule change and manages the rules, they put out a report on the pricing review, and they're looking at reintroducing fixed network charges. So we're going back to that sort of, because they want to protect how networks are getting their cost recovery and manage the so-called equity issue. But what they're doing with that is they are actually increasing the equity issue by going backward to, I call it the dinosaur age, of having fixed network charges rather than trying to solve for how networks currently are incentivized to spend money in the first place.
Very interesting. Okay, very
Mm.
interesting. Now, the conversation we are having, it's maybe a decade or two ahead relative to the rest of the world, right? The problem that you are sitting on in Australia, saying, okay, sort of we have almost the same amount of rooftop solar as the national grid, electric vehicle coming, government spending billions of dollars on battery subsidies. Every third home might have battery in 5 years' time. This is not where the rest of the world is. Still people talking about feed-in tariff, still people talk. So what do you tell the world? I mean, what to do correct right now, those countries where maybe wholesale electricity market is not there, still it's a sort of single state-owned utilities, not making enough money. There are a lot of countries in former Central Asia and all over Asia in that basket. I don't know much about Africa, but I'm sure it would be the same.
Absolutely. I would say two things. While they're fixing the bulk energy problem, where is the bulk energy going to come from when you turn your switch on? And some of those countries don't even have some of these solutions. I would say turn your focus and look at all the different technologies that exist right now that basically make sure that every person can have access to electricity. Solar is now such a cheap form of electricity, if not one of the cheapest. Price on batteries is coming down significantly. And these schemes that we're seeing in Australia and some of these other countries will only have that positive impact globally on the production and price of batteries. So that is only on one-way trajectory, which is down. And I say these solutions currently exist, these technologies exist. It's how do we make sure that we are giving access to people in the right places so that they don't miss out. And I think, this is probably one of the easiest ways of solving for that energy poverty, if you like. Whereas maybe 15 years ago, a lot of these technologies were still niche. They were very expensive. If you remember, the cost of solar was so expensive back in between 2010, 2015. And it was because of the incentives and creating the massive demand for them that basically meant massive production and reduction in price. And that is currently happening in batteries. And I think that's probably one of the most direct ways of solving energy poverty across the various countries that are struggling with it at the moment. And whether that's at a household level, and houses differ depending on what country you're in. Not everyone lives in a house like we do here in Australia. We're very lucky, but whether you live in apartments, whether you live in community, precincts with other people, you can still have solar and battery solutions to give people access to electricity in those communities.
Yes, I mean, other thing is that what Australia just announced to be sort of implemented from 1st of July, the 3-hour free electricity,
Yes.
where the country has so much solar in the middle of the day and sort of pricing going negative. People say, okay, why don't you bring all your demand during the day? At least we use solar as much. And that can happen anywhere in the world, no?
Yeah. So of course, it's very contentious. The 3-hour solar is a very contentious conversation because depending on who you're talking to, there's always winners and losers.
Yep.
In this particular instance, potentially the losers are the people who are providing the electricity because they can't charge for it. There is an argument that actually it impacts everybody because the cost of implementing it is then smeared on it. But I think if I take a more positive view on it, I think the most important element of this new policy is that it will force energy retailers and electricity networks to come to the party, which is what's needed right now. It's a good step in the right direction. Yes, it's small, it's temporary, and it's for people who are on standard default offers rather than market offers. But if we can implement it for one group in our society, we can implement it for everybody. And that's the point that is being proven out of this. This policy will actually incentivize customers to move their energy consumption from one part of the day to another as well, so that they can take advantage of the free electricity. And what that does is it actually then solves a network problem. The network underutilization problem can be solved through this. But I think the biggest benefit of this tariff is that basically it will force the big energy companies to fix their systems to innovate. If we don't force them to fix their systems to innovate, we're not going to see innovations because they are very comfortable, right? They're regulated monopolies. They get a return on investment where the people, they don't have to win customers to get a return on investment. So they are in the perfect place not to spend money on innovation, but to spend money just to increase their profits. And so this tariff reform, I think tariff reform in Australia goes back to my conversation earlier in our podcast, that tariff reform continues to be the biggest blocker in Australia's clean energy transition, especially for the take-up of rooftop solar batteries and future vehicle to grid. And I don't mean future vehicle to grid is in the next decade. Future vehicle to grid is happening now. How do we enable it through the right tariffs, through the right incentives, and having to be able to share the benefits of the renewable energy with all customers?
Yeah, I mean, we will have a separate conversation with few people on this 3-hour free electricity. I think it's something quite unique, because if it's an off-peak tariff, basically with zero tariff, and that's why it's getting the attention, right? We all had peak off-peak tariff, right?
It's the zero cost.
Zero has that power of saying it is zero. You divide by anything by zero, it's infinity. Zero is powerful.
Zero is zero, exactly.
Yeah. Like when I charge by EV in Sydney, sometimes I go to pick up something coffee and there's a free electricity charge. You got maybe a bloody, 5 kilowatt hour or something. It's nothing at $1.50. But that zero, power of zero, it's quite funny in a sense. So thank you very much for your time. But before we go, do you want to highlight anything?
No, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Sahel, and thank you for taking such leadership and in your podcast to talk about these really important conversations and the debates that we need to have, and providing that channel for transparency.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot from this conversation. That's my sort of interest. Of course, keep up to date and talk to knowledgeable people like yourself. What's the best way to find you if any of the listeners want to look you up?
Yeah, so I can definitely provide my details for you. But if you look up Nexa Advisory, you can always you can send us an email through the website. So that's www.nexaadvisory.com.au. And you can leave an email, and that would come to me directly and the team here at Nexa.
And also LinkedIn, of course, right?
Of course, LinkedIn is available. Ask someone for my email is available. Yes, I'm very approachable and reachable.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. If you enjoyed this, don't forget the full video is on YouTube. Just search Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.